Hey folks, it's the holiday season, my favorite time of year. Thanksgiving is coming up as I record this video, and so I thought it'd be fun to talk a little bit about the origins of the foods on our Thanksgiving table in the United States. Now, of course, we know Thanksgiving is this nice little tale about the first meeting between the Pilgrims and the Native Americans in the New England area and how they helped each other out and had this nice little dinner together. That story is not quite as cute as we'd like to believe, but I don't want to talk about that today. I want to talk about the actual things on our Thanksgiving table, which is now very much an American and somewhat a Canadian tradition. So, what's on that table? Well, traditionally, even though every family is different and we all have our fun little traditions that go on our tables, some of the main pieces are, of course, the turkey, then mashed potatoes, cranberry sauce is a big one. We also have green bean casserole, though my family prefers peas. And then for dessert, we have generally pumpkin pie. So let's take a look at those foods and see where they came from. We'll start with dessert and work backwards. So let's start with pumpkin pie. Of course, its main ingredient is pumpkin. And pumpkin is definitely an American food. The earliest evidence we have of domesticated pumpkin comes from a dry cave in Oaxaca, Mexico. And it dates back to 9,000 years ago. Pumpkin and squashes in general was one of the very first things that Native Americans domesticated. By the time the Pilgrims arrived in New England, pumpkins had spread from Mexico in all directions and all the way up to New England. So the Algonquin speakers there actually had pumpkins, and that was something they shared with the Pilgrims. Now, the word pumpkin, some people say it's got a Greek root, but it sounds to me a lot closer to the Algonquin word po-punk-kun, and that is again how we found that name. Po-punk-kun and pumpkin, that's the origin of the word pumpkin. Now, my kids don't really like that pumpkin pie, so we also on our table serve another pie the kids like. Guess what it is? It's chocolate pie. And where does chocolate come from? Again, Mesoamerica. Now, there are some studies, actually one in particular study, that's nowadays saying that chocolate actually had its origins in the Amazon. But I'm going to hold off my judgment there. I want to see some more studies, because the one thing that study lacks, yes, DNA is giving us all sorts of information that used to be hidden from us. But when you look at chocolate in Mesoamerica, there's this huge cultural movement around it. There's art, there's stories. Chocolate is everywhere there. The one thing that bugs me about the stuff in the Amazon is that, yes, there are associated plants with cacao there, but where's the cultural enthusiasm? They found a couple of jars in the site there on the Peru-Ecuador border that seem to have theobromite inside, which is the key ingredient to identify it as chocolate. But there's absolutely no art. We know that the Andean civilizations had very, very strong ties into the Amazon. And if chocolate was really there, where's all the art involving chocolate? The Peruvians have art that shows potatoes, they have art that shows corn, a variety of foods, but not in one single piece of art do I see chocolate. So until I start seeing that or a whole lot of other studies backing up this first big one, I'm going to hold off and I'm going to continue to give chocolate to Mesoamerica. So how about that green bean casserole on the table? Well, green beans definitely came from the Americas. And in the case of green beans, it's interesting. There were independent domestications both in South America and Central America leading up into Mexico. And that started, at least DNA studies say, about 8,000 years ago. We don't have that archaeologically, but DNA is giving us this new dimension. So let's go with that. They say 8,000 years ago. Now, we know that they were a big part of everyone's diet in the pre-Columbian times. The Aztecs had a word for green beans. It was ixotl. The Inca also had a word for green beans. They were cauchus. Now the Maya, we don't really have a word for green beans, but we know they had them. We do know the word for bean, which the Maya had a ton of them. Most of the world's beans do come from the Americas. The Maya word for bean was bu'ul. And so if we take the Maya word yash for green, maybe it was yash bu'ul. Who knows? But in any event, definitely American and on our Thanksgiving table. Cranberry sauce. Where did cranberries come from? Well, they are definitely a part of our Thanksgiving table. My kids hate them, but I put them on the table every year because that's what my parents did and that's what their parents did. Now, it seems like berries was a big thing from Europe. They'd be from Europe, right? No, cranberries are also from the Americas. Specifically, they were growing in these kind of marshy areas of New England. And when the Pilgrims arrived, the Narragansett showed them cranberries. Now, the Narragansett, they didn't use cranberries very much as food. Mostly it was used as dyes. In hard times, they knew they could eat them, and seeing that the Pilgrims were in hard times, they clued them in about cranberries and their edible nature. Now, they had a totally different word for cranberries. The Narragansett word is sasemenish. Very, very different from cranberry. Cranberry is actually a German word. The original German settlers in New England saw these, cultivated them a little bit, and saw that the flowers that came out of the cranberry plants were these long stems with a flower on top, and they thought those looked like the neck and head of cranes. And so they called them cranberries. Another popular dish on the Thanksgiving table is candied yams, and that one has an interesting history. Because yams are actually from Africa, not the Americas. The funny thing is, though, the ones that show up on our Thanksgiving tables in America, they're not made of yams. They're made of sweet potatoes. And sweet potatoes are definitely from the Americas. We have an origin for them, again, about 8,000 years ago, says DNA, in Central America. And then they spread out to South America, especially into the Caribbean. And so when Columbus got to the Caribbean, actually, sweet potatoes were being grown all over the place, and they learned that and ate those. Now, eventually, those crops from the Caribbean moved over to the East Coast, and they were being cultivated by the first generations of black African slaves for their slave owners. And so the Africans coming from Africa and knowing about yams took a look at those sweet potatoes and said, this is a very similar food. Even though they're much softer, yams have this outer cortex that's almost as thick as bark. And the food itself is much, much harder. Sweet potatoes are softer and easier to work with, but the first American slaves saw them as yams and cooked them up as yams as they would have back in their homelands. So today on our Thanksgiving tables, we have these things that are called candied yams, but actually they're made of sweet potatoes. And the mix-up there begins way back in the origins of the United States and the slaves. I think my favorite part of the foods on the table at Thanksgiving is the mashed potatoes. I like making those. Me and my family make fake potatoes most of the year, but for Thanksgiving, we actually cut them up and we make them from fresh potatoes. Potatoes, as I hope you're aware, come from Peru and the Andean region. Potatoes were then transferred at European contact back over to Europe. Actually, one of the first people to bring them back to Europe was Sir Walter Raleigh Scott. And he brought them specifically to Ireland because he felt like the environment of Ireland was very similar to the highlands in the Andean world where they were growing so well. So he brought them over to Ireland, and they became a huge staple and success there. They traveled all around Europe, but Ireland very much so bonded with that potato. And for 300 years, it was their primary crop. So from about the 1530s up until the mid-1850s area, that was their main crop and sustained all of the Irish people. But then, as we're all well aware, a terrible blight hit the potatoes and it caused the Potato Famine. And the English didn't do much to help the poor Irish in that. But it was a huge disaster. But I would like to point out that For 300 years, it worked great. And it wouldn't have happened to the Irish if it wasn't for the slow process of relying on just one or two varieties of potato. About a dozen varieties of potato made it to Ireland, and the rich tended to use all sorts of potatoes, but the poor were using this one big, easy-to-grow variety that they called lumper. And the lumpers went bad, and with it, hundreds of thousands of people starved. It was a terrible thing. That would have never happened in the Andean world, because the Andean world had over 1,000 varieties of potato, and they grew them all over the Andes, some in lower elevations, some in higher elevations. So if a blight took over one species or one area, well, they could just use their road system to import different kinds of potatoes from different areas. So the Andean world, who actually domesticated it, probably starting again about 8,000 years ago, developed along that route a variety and a planting technique that kept them safe from those kinds of famine. It was both the agricultural practices, but also the cultural practices in which they cared about one region versus another. And if one region was suffering, especially in the Inca Empire, well, food was imported there from another region. It would have gone much differently for Ireland if England had simply lent them a hand. Now, what about the name potato? It's funny because the name in South America, the Quechua language, the Inca, handed down the name papa. And that's what the Spanish call them, papas. But we call them potatoes. Why? Well, that was a weird little twist that began in the Caribbean. When Columbus first sailed and he got to Cuba and he met the Taino people, they were cultivating sweet potatoes. Not potatoes, sweet potatoes. And they called them batatas. And so the word batata got transferred to Europe with the first sweet potatoes, and then later Sir Walter Raleigh Scott brings potatoes to Europe. And since there was already a thing that looked very similar to them, they started using that batata name, turning into potato. That's where we get that word from. And just one more thing about sweet potatoes and potatoes, which are both on our Thanksgiving tables. They're not related species. They look similar, but they are not related. Sweet potatoes are a root vegetable, and potatoes are a tuber. Sweet potatoes are actually much more similar to carrots than they are potatoes. Carrots, by the way, Persia. Now to that main event on our Thanksgiving table, the turkey. The turkey, again, it came from the Americas, specifically Mexico and Central America. When Columbus and his crew first came over and the people following him met the first Maya, that is where they found turkeys. The Maya had both wild and domestic turkeys. But as they traveled through Mesoamerica, so did everyone. Turkeys had been in Mesoamerica for a long time. Archaeologically speaking, we find our first domesticated turkey bones in Maya trash pits around 300 BCE. So there was an interesting path here. In the 1500s, the Spanish encounter these turkeys in Mesoamerica. They immediately see their value. They're like giant chickens, so they bring them over to Europe. And for over 100 years, turkeys become part of the diet of Europe. And so by the time the Pilgrims sail across in the 1600s, they actually bring domesticated turkeys with them. And so the Pilgrims themselves had turkeys on their ships when they landed at Plymouth Rock. Funny enough, though, they ate all those turkeys before that fateful meeting where they had their first Thanksgiving dinner. How about the word turkey? It does not come from the Americas. The Aztecs had words for turkeys. In fact, they had two different words for domesticated turkeys and wild turkeys. Wild turkeys were huexalotl, and domesticated turkeys were tololin. The Maya also had words for domesticated and wild. The domesticated one was called a cuts. In fact, a cuts is drawn into one of the four surviving Maya books, the Dresden Codex. It played an outsized role in the translation of Maya hieroglyphs. Yuri Konorozov, back in the 50s, was looking through that book, and he saw a clear picture of a turkey, and the glyph above it said ku tsu. And he looked through Yucatec dictionaries and said, look, that's the Maya name for turkey. There's a turkey, ku tsu. This is a phonetic script. So turkeys actually played an important role in our breaking of the Maya code. Now, where did that word come from then? Well, it was another one of those European perspective things. They had never seen a turkey before. So when it shows up to Europe, they thought it looked very much like the game fowl that came from the Ottoman Empire. And they called it a turkey cock because it was from the region that they were calling Turkey. So when the turkey showed up, they thought, well, it looks like a guinea fowl, and they called that turkey cock, and eventually the word turkey stuck. But it had nothing to do with the names that the Native Americans had given it. But hold on, one more little thing about the name turkey. If you're a Spanish speaker, you know that they don't call it turkey, they call it pavo. But pavo is clearly not related to either of those Native American words either. So where did that come from? That comes from their own perspective. A big bird like that they did know about was the peacock. And the peacock's name was pavo. And so they called turkeys pavos and peacocks pavos. And over time, peacocks actually got renamed. They're called pavo real to separate them from the turkey pavo. Now, to wrap this up, let's talk about the reality of the table that was there between the Native Americans and the Pilgrims. Our pictures are always showing this big, beautiful turkey in the middle of the table. Scholars don't think that there was any turkey on that table. In fact, they think the meat was deer and fish. So that is one more example that our Thanksgiving traditions are actually a nice little fairy tale. But I think we can take away that the foods that we're eating there are all gifts from Native America. From the turkey to the pumpkin to even the chocolate pie, all these foods were gifts that Europe got from Native America. So while we're sitting at our Thanksgiving table trying to avoid politics, let's all take a moment to remember that some of our favorite foods are gifts from the ancient Americas. If you like what I had to say there, maybe you'd like to see some of my other videos. Here are two right here you might be interested in. Give them a try.